So, good afternoon. Welcome back from the coffee break. Welcome to the panel of race, which is slightly reduced from 3 to 2 papers. Patrick Bernhardt is sick and couldn't make it this afternoon. So we will run until 5, which was like the scheduled order in our reduced schedule. I will introduce our two speakers, and they will give their papers, and after that we will have ample time for discussion. The first paper will be by ULRIKE Lindner from University of Cologne. Racist thought as basic element of cooperation between fin-de-siècle empires, scope and limits. And then we will have Eileen Ryan from Temple University in Philadelphia, troubling the Italian color line under the fascist race laws.
Yeah, thank you very much once again. A big thank you to Cyrus and to David and to the Du Bois Foundation for hosting this wonderful conference. It's really nice to be here. Thanks. I try to be very short. My paper is based on research I have done in the last maybe 15 years in the field of inter-imperial exchange, connections, comparisons, and rivalries in colonial Africa during high imperialism. And in the paper here, I argue that these substantial forms of cooperation were mainly based on the racist assumptions of a European white superiority in the colonies that should not be questioned and that was to be upheld against the indigenous population under all circumstances. And I would like to expand and apply the notion of Marilyn Lake and Henry Reynolds. They stressed the growing importance of whiteness and white superiority thinking in the colonies of the British Empire, and I would like to go on in the frame of inter-imperial exchange and support. Racist theories and theories of social Darwinism were, of course, widespread in all European colonial empires, as well as in the US during the last third of the 19th and the first decades of the 20th century. White colonizers saw it as a fact that the indigenous population were inferior to them and derived their claim to power in the colonies at least partly from this conviction. The paper will look at 2 examples in which such a connection is quite evident. You could, of course, have many other examples, namely at racist segregation in African colonial cities that went along with the creation of white European expatriate societies there. And secondly, it will look at the support and knowledge transfer in colonial wars and how this was then challenged by the First World War. When we turn to the first point, in Africa, all European colonial powers either had or conquered colonies at the end of the 19th century, and the image of being white colonizers and having a common undertaking became a central notion of their colonial life. I would like to look in a first step at the planning and regulating and the racial segregation, and in a second step look at the white community living there. And I take Dar es Salaam in German East Africa as an example for most of my arguments. The planning of these cities was in the hand of various experts, administrators, military and railway engineers, physicians and architects and urban planners. And you can already in the planning stage, you can observe a strong inter-imperial exchange of knowledge and various forms of cooperation. You had these representative buildings, and you had to show the power and superiority of the respective colonial rulers. And this is the most extreme example. It's cartoon, and it's how Kitchener planned it after the siege of after 1898, right? And he tried to plan it in the form of a Union Jack to represent British power. But we can also look at Dar es Salaam as a military parade in the streets of Dar es Salaam at the same time where you had these these colonial houses and the wide streets where you could present the military to the population and to the white class. And furthermore, based on this racist theories of high imperialism, non-contact and segregation measures were the focus of interest in African colonial urban planning. And this was to be reflected accordingly in the cities. And if you look at a map of Dar es Salaam, you see the white is the European quarter, the lightly gray is the Asian quarter, and the black is the African quarter. And that was done with different building regulations to make differences in the neighborhoods. So the argument was often that the residential areas of Europeans had to be protected from diseases and other dangers. And that was typical for African colonies at the end of the 19th century. And the British took over Tanzania as a mandate after the League, from the League of Nations, but they continued with this segregation, even if it wasn't seen in the mandate as a good policy. But segregation was the rule. If we now look at the white groups who lived in such colonial cities, you had quite strong inter-European circles. I mean, you had British, Belgian, Italian, Greeks, and other Europeans who lived in Dar es Salaam, and they all saw themselves as superior over the indigenous population. They formed white communities, and they had their colonial life in clubs, in events, in hotels, with teas, balls, and sport events. And it was, of course, this was contested, yeah. For example, Greek merchants were seen as South European, not proper white European. Only rich Greek businessmen and ship owners could move in European circles. Poorer Greeks could not enter these clubs. And Syrians could never enter the white clubs, but they could do business with other people. And of course, these were hybrid places, and the segregation was not always observed like this, and it was contested, but still it was a basic fact of colonial rule at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century. And a revealing source for this is the paper, The African World, Cape Cairo Express, that was published from 1902 until 1944 in London, and summarized important news from British, German, French, Belgian, and Portuguese African colonies for whites living in Africa. It was published weekly from 1902 onwards and catered for the group I'm referring to here, an expatriate white colonial society. And so it contributed to constructing such a group, and the readers could feel themselves as a white community when reading such a newspaper. I don't want to go on this, but I have it also in my written paper. Anyway, Dar es Salaam featured quite prominently, as you can see here. This is one edition from 1913 and one from 1904. You had always these, it was a safari destination. It has a big issue on the 30 years of the colony, and so on and so forth. If I now go to my second point, inter-imperial cooperation in colonial wars. I think this is even more a significant argument. You have here a lot of knowledge transfer, but also actual support. You have a lot of knowledge transfer from French and British military experts. They had experience in so-called savage wars, be it in the conquest of Algeria or in other wars in the British Empire, and this became a standard in military manuals. And the one most important was already quoted by Alexander Morrison, is Charles Corwell's book on small wars. And it established as a standard military manual for the British, but also for the French, and it was also known in German military circles. And it had this notion that war against the savages and semi-civilized races implied a different, more brutal form of war, which is killing prisoners of war, destroying fields, carrying off livestock, burning stores and houses, and therefore destroying the livelihood of the indigenous population. And this was really shared by all European colonial powers, and therefore a source of continuous support of each other in colonial wars. And then you had actual support over the border what I could show in the Herero and Nama War, the Cape Colony delivered horses, food, water to the German troops. And even if this wasn't recognized on a diplomatic level, yeah, but it was done on a lower local level. And accordingly, the African world wrote in 1906, accordingly to this notion, everybody in South Africa, Britain, Boer, or German, will be glad to see this protracted struggle come to a close as a successful resistance being offered by the badly armed and generally badly equipped rebels can, especially under present circumstances, produce nothing but a demoralizing effect on the native mind and will cause a heavy loss to German prestige throughout the Dark Continent. And I think that was the main thing they shouldn't lose or it shouldn't go on because it was very bad for the white race. And this was challenged with the outbreak of World War I, of course. And I just brought you another quote for that I won't read it completely, but Heinrich Schnee, the former governor of German East Africa, wrote in his publication on the history of East Africa on the effects of World War I, it was obviously hard for the blacks to grasp that the whites, who had always preached peace and order to the natives and had suppressed wars between them by force of arms, should now suddenly shoot themselves to death. It was even more inexplicable to them that the black Askari, who until then had only been used against savage people, should now fight against other whites on the orders of their white masters. And I gave a last example to show this attitude even better. In the beginning of the campaign in East Africa, German and British officers buried the white British and German officers together and the African soldiers separately. And even the dead body of a white officer should not lie together with the black body of an African Askari, rather with his European enemy. And this changed after 1 or 2 years, when the battles got harder and no one had the nerve to observe this any longer. And one has, of course, to add in the end that after World War I, all colonial powers tried to return to the pre-war racist colonial order, even if they had to make some concessions towards the colonized people who had fought for them during the war. To conclude shortly, I think I have shown to what extent inter-imperial cooperation in the colonies, at least in Africa, was based on the thought of a white superiority. And the white societies functioned and continued to function only with this underlying conviction of a common racist superiority. And especially in colonial wars, this had to be upheld, and the racist burying rituals with separate graves for whites and blacks after battle, I think that's quite obvious that race plays a very important role. So they were only given up in course of the long drawn-out World War I, but I think it became also clear how contested racist supremacy thinking was in daily colonial life and how it had to be constantly re-established in practice. Thank you very much.
That was very well done on timing. I will endeavor to do the same. We'll see. Thank you, Cyrus, for inviting me, and to David for organizing, and for you all for being here. When Cyrus sent an email inviting me to this conference and told me that it was about inter-imperial and trans-imperial networks and competition and cooperation, I started thinking about all the different ways that I could kind of represent Italian imperialism in that sort of a realm. And the most obvious way that stuck out to me was to think about how Italian imperialism in the late 19th and early 20th centuries was really based on a kind of competitive and cooperative model. I mean, this is the thesis of Richard Bosworth's classic Italy, the least of the great powers, that kind of talks about Italy as this pivotal, weak power in Europe, which had deep implications for Italian imperialism. And it's something I cover a lot in my first book when I think about Italian imperialism and how Italian imperialists were thinking about their occupation of Libya as something that kind of imitated other imperial powers, competed with other imperial powers in their relationship with Muslim elites in particular. Another approach that's quite clear and perhaps obvious with Italian imperialism is exactly what we were talking about this morning with kind of trans-imperial migratory patterns. Much like the Japanese and the Chinese cases this morning, Italians at the end of the 19th century were fleeing Italy in droves, going across the Atlantic, going to other European colonies, settling there, and the Italian state kind of quite purposefully reinterpreted that as a new form of imperialism, that one that was less violent and therefore perhaps better than the British and the French. Lucy Real has written a recent article that Michelle mentioned this morning. Mark Choate wrote more extensively on that. But rather stubbornly, instead, I actually decided to focus on more recent research that I've been doing for a new book project that is called Black Italy, which examines Black diasporic experiences and ideas about Blackness in Italy from Italian unification in the mid-19th century to the late 20th century. Even though in this new project, empire as such is very decentralized from my lens, and it doesn't quite obviously fit in with trans-imperial or inter-imperial competition, cooperation, that sort of thing. But I think it works out in the end. You can tell me if it doesn't. Part of what I wanted to do is use this opportunity to think through a court case that I wrote about in my contribution involving an Italian woman named Anna Maria Tassone, who was charged and convicted in 1938 with violating the defense of the race by having a relationship of a marital nature with a man named Ramadan Ali, a Libyan man who was living in Rome with Tassone and their two children, maritalmente, or in a marital state, but not actually legally married. The conviction of Anna Maria Tassone was based on racial legislation that was first passed in 1937 in the Italian colonies, and that criminalized sexual relationships between Italian men, primarily, and East African women. And the gender dynamics of this are quite important. The 1938 race laws applied to the Italian metropole, and of course targeted Italian Jews primarily. But they also affected Black Africans living in Italy, especially people originating from the colonies in East Africa. In the winter of 1938, the Italian Ministry of Africa coordinated with the Ministry of the Interior to track the presence of colonial subjects with the goal of expelling as many as possible. And it's in the course of that surveillance operation that state officials identified Ramadan Ali and Anna Maria Tassone as targets. The application of the race laws, both in the colonies and in the metropole, points to one of the aspects of Italian imperialism that I've always found most intriguing, which is how starkly it lays bare what Frederick Cooper and Ann Stoler identified as the tensions of empire. In other words, the always imperfect efforts to establish a clear demarcation between colonizer and colonized at the heart of a supposedly universalizing mission. The sense that Italy had to catch up with the other European powers, and that Italians had to be made into true, meaning bourgeois, Europeans in the process, meant that there was not time for a more gradual development of a culture of colonial hierarchies that arguably you see in the British and French context in the 18th and 19th centuries. The race laws were an effort instead to impose a colonial culture from above, reflecting anxieties that lower-class Italian settlers would not maintain a strict color line. But the position of Libyans like Ramadan Ali in the hierarchy imposed by the race laws was ambiguous. And it's only actually by coming to this question through my more recent research into Black Italy that I've started to kind of understand that in racialized terms. East Africans living in Italy were far more vulnerable to persecution and expulsion. And though she was sentenced to a year in prison, Tessone's case was ultimately overturned on appeal, based on an argument that linked the race laws exclusively to colonial subjects of Italian East Africa, or, quote, foreigners who belong to a population that has traditions, customs, and juridical and social concepts analogous to those of the subjects of Italian East Africa. That's according to the decision of the appeals court. So what I suggest in my paper is that this court case, along with other examples I provide, demonstrates the creation of a clear hierarchy among Italian colonial subjects within the fascist racial imagination. And it's a hierarchy that reflected a couple of different issues that the Italian imperial state was dealing with in the late 1930s, at the same time that they were trying to create a clear sense of Italian whiteness. One was the need to establish some sense of peace and security in North Africa after a particularly violent suppression of anti-colonial resistance in the late 1920s. And the other was an interest in promoting a kind of pro-Islamic foreign policy in the Middle East to try to sell fascism and Italian colonial rule as relatively peaceful compared to other European powers. And the way that, that I suggest in my paper that the fascist state did this was to make two moves. One was to racialize Arabs as Muslim primarily. And I use an example from the magazine La Difesa della Razza, the Defense of the Race, that talks about the possibility of drawing a clear biological separation between Italians and Arab Muslim North Africans by using Islam, by saying Muslims do not want to mix with non-Muslims. Therefore, if we have a pro-Islamic policy, we do not need to identify or define Arabs as biologically distinctive. We can still attain the same objective. So that was one part of this tapestry. The other part of it was to call on Italy's own ambiguous connection to whiteness as an identity. The process of Italian imperialism was happening at the same time as the process of Italian nation building. This gets back to some conversations we had yesterday. And part of that was really about defining Southern Italians as white and trying to understand the connection between the Italian nation and European concepts of whiteness. So as I lay out in my contribution, there was in the early 20th century, in the first years of the 20th century, an alternative concept of whiteness that the Italian anthropologist Giuseppe Sadeghi established, known as Mediterraneanism, that coexisted with Aryanism. There was a sense that Italians could claim some connection to Aryanism, but Mediterraneanism promised instead a future for a white Europe with the Mediterranean at its core, and with Italians potentially leading the way. And that ambiguity, I suggest, means that there was a racialization of Arab Muslims in Italian Libya, but it was a process that demonstrates the malleability of biological and cultural racial theories. And I think it's important that we think about these as distinctive but connected processes, especially for an imperial power that claimed to be late to the game. And we could talk a lot about lateness in the Q&A if you'd like. This is a connection to the German and Japanese cases, and has huge implications for the historiography of Italian imperialism, but also for the way Italian imperialists were talking about the need to establish a color line, that they were late, and especially for a European nation with this tenuous relationship to whiteness. The ambiguity of Italian whiteness threatened the fascist effort to solidify Italy's racial identity, as the story of Anna Maria Tessone and Ali Ramadan suggests. But it also offered a tool in what Etienne Balibar has pointed to as the constant competition among European imperial powers, all priding themselves, as he wrote, on their particular humaneness by projecting the image of racism on the colonial practices of their rivals. the other white being the bad white. So even as the fascist regime embraced an explicitly racist program in relationship to Jews and East Africans, it used Mediterraneanism and a cultural and biological racialization of Arabs as Muslim to claim a certain amount of innocence in connection to racism in North Africa. Thank you.
Thank you very much for two very evocative papers. So let us start with a round of questions from the audience until the iPad arrives. Okay, there are many, many hands. Let's start on top, please. On the left, please. Yes. Yes, exactly.
Yeah, maybe 2 or 3 questions to Eileen Ryan. Nice to meet you. What about the long history of racism toward Muslims in the early modern period, and even the anti-blackness in the 16th, 17th, 18th century, which is not really, part of what is studied currently in Italy? And the second question is what you said about Muslimness and how to exclude them, and at the same time saying that they are different, is completely, it's really related to the French experience in Algeria. So to what extent, we know that Italian colonialism was extremely influenced by the experience of Algeria. So what do you make of that? And I like what you said about the Mediterranean identity. So what about the Mezzogiorno and how the people from the south are seen as not completely part of Italy even nowadays, and how does it play to your own kind of research? Thank you so much.
Am I answering?
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Mohammed. It's very nice to meet you. That's a lot of questions. They're very good questions, and thank you for the questions. The longer history of anti-Muslim racism, you were saying, I think, or anti-blackness as well, in the early modern period in Italy, I think is quite complicated. From what I've seen in scholarship that looks at the presence of people who were Semitically dark for example, in Venice in the 15th century and the 16th century. One of the problems is that the classifications don't map onto modern classifications, and so the language that's used is highly ambiguous, and there's a lot of slippage between language that focuses on somatic differentiation and Islam. And so it's always, Saracen, for example, is often used interchangeably with Moro, and which is related to the idea of Moors, and that's used interchangeably with Nero, black. And so I think it opens up a lot of fascinating possibilities for rethinking racialization and the history of racialization. And it really means that, in part, that the kinds of questions I'm asking, I feel like I have to confine to the modern era. And when you ask the question about Algeria, yes, it's very important. I think it's also not something that the fascist regime wanted to think about or at least display, right? They wanted to suggest they were doing something quite different. The liberal government before fascism, they were much more interested in learning from other empires. And so there was an effort in the late 19th century, in the first decade of the 20th century, to translate as many Orientalist works as possible from French and German, for example. And also to learn from the Ottoman example. In Tripoli found documents. They had like, oh, there were these documents left from the Ottomans when they fled, and translated those into Italians to try to understand how do we negotiate rule with Muslim elites the way the Ottomans did. So that was part of the liberal regime. The fascist regime, they quite clearly rejected some sense of continuity. To the extent that you had people like Carlo Nalino, the famous Italian Orientalist, who was lamenting the absence of expertise, all of these like, kind of dumb young fascists who were then promoted to important positions without having any real knowledge or understanding of the Middle East or North Africa. And the Mezzogiorno is not quite completely white, is a very important part of this. I mean, when you look at Italian unification, there are so many documents in the decades after unification of Italian national officials and military officials going to the Italian South and talking about it as if it's Africa, comparing it quite explicitly to Africa, comparing Southern peasants to Africans. And so that's a key part of the development of this idea of Mediterraneanism, was because Aryanism, which was early on embraced by certain Italian racial theorists like Cesare Lombroso, it had this idea of Southern degeneracy. And what Giuseppe Sergi suggested is that, yes, the Southerners have fallen behind, they've become kind of corrupted racially, but imperialism will make us pure again, and it will do so from the Mediterranean. It will get back to some kind of originary civilizational model from the Mediterranean. And so this is part of a way of kind of saving the Mezzogiorno by making Southerners white through imperial expansion.
Thank you. We continue over there with 2 questions.
Thank you. Question for Eileen about this racialization of Muslims. So I'm interested in sort of the broader origins of the idea of using using Muslim rather than some ethnic name, and could it be related to anti-Semitism, where religion is sort of the primary identity, and in the context of the nation state system, it's kind of demeaning, right? So there's no ethnicity and unassimilable and all this rhetoric. And then looking at sort of the contemporary usage of this in Europe with all these various different refugees coming in and being called just Muslim, and even earlier with genocide perpetrators in Southeastern Europe also calling their victims Muslim rather than whatever group they belong to, right? Thank you.
We continue with the question by Lara. Thank you.
Oh, sure. Thank you so much for these talks. My question is also for Eileen. I think this is really exciting research, and I'm really happy to hear about it. I'm wondering, I'm thinking of Sarah Gualtieri's work on Arabs in the United States and the sort of the liminal position that they occupy between these categories in the United States of between black and white, and how they make the case for their whiteness, and then how she traces that back to the Middle East, right? Thinking about this as a transnational process where before they emigrated, they didn't have to think in terms of these categories, but then are trying to make the case that they're white, and then this gets transposed back to the Middle East. And as she's discussing this, of course, she's taking us through also like how other groups from Europe, Southern Europeans like Italians, were also subject to lynchings and this type of, nativist and racist sentiment in the United States. I wonder, with the scope of migration from Italy to the United States, if there's similar kinds of transnational connections, and if any of those categories in the United States end up also influencing this discourse. And you might not have the same type of return migration or transnational linkages, but I'm just sort of curious, if we move the story outside of Europe, if the categories in the United States come into play in different ways about making the case for whiteness in Italy.
Would you like to respond?
Okay, thank you for those wonderful questions. Leila, the broader origins, I mean, I think that's such a complicated question. I'll instead address the issue of if it's connected to anti-Semitism. And I think actually not. And I'm still trying to think through this because when I was looking through like La Difesa della Razza, the primary purpose of that was to establish a sense of racial awareness among Italians as white. This magazine was widely distributed during the fascist era, late fascist era. And it's just this combination of virulently anti-Semitic and anti-Black articles, one after the other, with just these like little mentions of Arab that I mentioned in my paper as Muslim rather than biologically racialized. And so there's the anti-Semitic articles are all about connecting biology to Semitic people rather than Judaism. So I would suggest that's quite different. And I do think it is, I mean, part of what inspired me to try to work through some of these questions is this sense in some of the recent work on migrants in Europe of trying to understand racialization and trying to suggest it's something quite new, racialization of Muslims in Europe. And I wanted to kind of pull out this longer history of it, a history that I kind of ignored in my first book because the Europeans were really good at drawing a veil over this form of racialization. So it takes some real digging to figure out. So it is partly about disconnecting people from any kind of nation-state identity. Of course, the same is true with Black Africans. So we could talk more about what that means. And for Lale, yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. And yes, the Italian migrants in America were racialized as other than white. I was talking to Louise about this at lunch. I think it's part of what happened is that I mean, I think I don't quite know how to periodize the end of that, like the kind of whitening of Italians in America, except it happened gradually and in these moments that I can identify. One is the invasion of Ethiopia in 1935, when you have street brawls between Italian Americans and African Americans in places like New York or Philadelphia. And this was part of like a surge in anti-Black sentiment among Italian Americans that helped to kind of crystallize a sense of whiteness in opposition to Blackness, I would suggest. And then there's also a longer process of suburbanization that I think is part of that history in certain parts of the United States. Where I live in South Philly, it's still very Italian. But in other parts of the United States, it is part of a whitening of Italians. But I don't know that I see that as being that closely connected to the racialization of Italians as white in Italy, in Europe. I think that was a process that happened in Italy and that was already happening before Italian Americans kind of became white within America.
Thank you. I'll jump in with a question from online from Shellen Wu, directed at ULRIKE. Do you see ideas about race making their way from the overseas colonies to the German East?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, of course. I mean, there are some ideas going to the German East, even during the Kaiserreich, because the German East there was also sort of whitening of the German East and getting rid of the Poles, and a sort of a population management that brought Germans to East Prussia. And Dörte Lerp has written on that a book, and where you can look at there is no explicit transfer of knowledge between these two colonies, but it's very clear that it's the same thinking that shapes these policies. And she looks at German Southwest Africa and East Prussia, and you can see quite a lot of very similar types of population management already before the First World War. And then there's, of course, a lot of very good scholarship where you see colonial legacies of Nazi imperialism in the East, and you can trace it back to some of the thinking is developed in colonial times. But
Apparently directly related to that question by Martin Duesenberry.
Yeah, thanks. I think it's possible that Shellen Wu may have been asking about Germany in China, as in that East, not Eastern Europe. And I had a follow-up question to that, which was about Qingdao, about colonial planning in Qingdao, and whether the sort of division of colonial cities in Africa that you're describing, how that maps into a Chinese setting, potentially. And then if one takes the story forward, when the Japanese then take over Qingdao, how that complicates the story, if you could say anything about that.
I can say a little bit on Qingdao, and it was also they tried to do the same racial order, but it wasn't as successful as it was in Africa, because rich Chinese people managed to live in the sort of European quarters, and it wasn't such a strict division. It was also a shorter time that the Germans were there, and it was not a real colony. They just they sort of hired it from the Chinese, and it was under the Marine, under the German Marine. So it was a little different setup. What you have in Samoa, you have the British and the Germans and the Americans there, but you always have this sort of segregation. But one has to say that the Asian cities are much more diverse, and that segregation was clearly much more important topic in Africa, and that was also the thinking of the imperial racists, that the Africans were on the lower ladder of racist hierarchies, and Asians were sort of in the middle, if one may say so. And that also corresponds with Dar es Salaam, where the Asians were in between the whites and the blacks. Yeah, it was in sort of a medium thing. So yeah, but on Japanese I can't say anything.
Okay,
sorry.
thank you.
Also directly related, Nadine Hay and Daniel Hedinger. Oh, okay. And Isabel, you go first.
Yeah, no, it's
That's
also
good.
directly related, because there is some work coming out that looks at colonial state planning of cities, and Qingdao is explicitly looked at there as well. And I guess there is a distinction to be made about how it works out and how it's planned. But I guess if you look at these plans, it's almost like one-on-one, the type of thinking. Also Nairobi, you have very similar work on that.
Yeah. Then, Nadine Hay and...
Yeah, thank you. So just a brief comment on this racial question when it comes to the Japanese. I think within the German Empire there was sort of this exceptional clause in the sort of colonial law that Japanese would count as white people. So yeah, just to mention that. But then I had other questions actually. And one was to actually both of you. So what would you think then about this, in a way, convergence of categories such as race and religion? I mean, is it really about race, or is it also about religion, and when does it shift in a way? And connected to that, and in a way also not related to it, is this question about imperial war, kind of. Because in both cases, I think we have to do with this sort of conquest, but also uprisings, and there, related to that sort of violence, is this question of how to justify it. And there's this whole literature, as you might be aware of, that sort of tries to figure out what is imperial violence versus national violence, and what is a sort of imperial war versus a national war, and etc. so forth. And one of the sort of markers usually is sort of this racialized issue. But to ask back now, is it all about race from the beginning? Because, I mean, as we all know, and then the archaic sort of and others coming into the picture, is it really that is the marker, or are there other issues at stake? And then first you sort of would separate the bodies, but at a certain point you won't. So is it really that what makes the difference?
Can we add Daniel Hedinger's question?
It's a question mainly for EILEEN, but probably a little bit connected to this. I mean, thinking from the point of the alliance between Germany and Italy, especially this anti-Semitic laws of '38 were a big issue in the sense then you can probably offer a new interpretation of the alliance. So for some times there was the reading that the Italians were more or less pushed into this. And then lately you have more people claiming that Mussolini knows what he is doing. And it's on this high point of Axis alliance where he is showing in some ways ideological affinity to Nazi Germany. But then I wonder how this is connected to this color line laws, which are pointing in a very different direction. And I just want, because I came more to the conclusion that by by the process of radicalization, fascist racism was very much pointing to people who were not visible. I mean, in the end, the most people who were killed by the Germans were Jews who were not even defined by the Nuremberg laws in any biological way. They were just in a cultural way or in a religious way. And that's also a paradox, because much of our discussion about how the Third Reich worked would point to a biological racism, but at the end of the day, the definitions didn't work out. And also in the Japanese case, I mean, 99% or 98% of the people who died in the Pacific Asian War were Asians of some kind, so not visibly different. I just wonder, your contribution could also be a contribution to how now this issue was discussed in the context of the Axis alliance, and I still can't see any solution to this. Yeah, thanks.
Then let us give the panelists a chance to respond to these couple of questions briefly. We have a long line of...
Okay, sorry. First, the convergence of categories, religion and race. I have to say that race becomes more important the longer the 19th century goes on. And of course, you have quite complicated cases in East Africa where the Germans at some point support Muslims, and they even take Muslim in their German administration schools, and the Christian missionaries protest that. So it's a very complicated field, right? But it's generally, if you look at these clubs and things like that, then it's quite clear that European is also Christian. As I said, the Syrians have really big problems to enter these white colonial clubs and the white colonial elite in Africa. And there's quite a strict sense that they don't belong. Of course, they do business with them. I mean, that's not the problem. And religion is very, it depends. It depends. But and the Imperial War, I think there is quite, I mean, this is very new research by Tom Menger. He worked on colonial wars in the British, German, and Dutch Empire in this period of high imperialism, and he could show that they all follow quite similar regimes of a savage war, of a policy of savage wars that's quite based on racist assumptions, and it's really different from what you do in a war against a sort of non-savage population, because this killing of prisoners of war, you do attrition, you kill cattle, you burn fields, you do all this. It's sort of counterinsurgency thing, and this is clearly established as something that is good if you do it against sort of the savage races and even against the Boers. The Boers were declared a half-savage race by, for example, by, I think it was Kitchener, because they didn't behave in the right European way, so you could use this sort of attrition against them. So in this time you have quite, it's quite racialized. And there is a difference between what you think of European war and colonial war. In the First World War, this starts to mix to some extent in some war theaters.
I'll respond really quickly to both Nadine and Daniel. I think it's important actually to differentiate between racialization and other forms of differentiation of others. And that's part of why in my first book I didn't talk about race at all, because I maybe naively took the Italians at their word, or I didn't see biological racism happening. And I think in the paper I wrote for this, I do. And it's because I'm looking in a different part of the archive where you see the clear racialization of Black East Africans as Black East Africans, and that's where you can kind of start to see the racialization of Arab North Africans, but in a different way, in a way that is quite deliberately fuzzy when it comes to biology versus religion. And I don't have an answer for you, Daniel. I think that's a really complicated question. Like 1936 was definitely a shift for the Italian state in terms of it became more racist, more explicitly racist, but there was certainly biopolitics at play from the beginning of the fascist regime when you look at, omni and maternity and the interest in creating an Italian state, an Italian nation, both in Italy and abroad among migrant populations. But I don't think I've never thought of this pointing to those not visible. That's quite the opposite of what I'm seeing in the Italian case.
Let's continue with 4 questions by Harald, then Paul Kramer, and then Cyrus. Or is something very directly related? Luis, please. Directly related. Okay, then Luis first. Okay,
it's my
please.
first question since the beginning.
Okay, then
raising
go
my
ahead.
hand since the morning. So.
Okay.
Anyway, I really like both your papers. And I have 2 comments. First is for Ulrike. Do you know the film La Gloire en Chantant of Jean-Jacques Annou? Oh, you have to see that film. It's a great film, and the story is taking place in the crossroads between the Chad, which belongs to the French, Nigeria, which belongs to the British, and Cameroon, which belongs to the German. And in that film, you have these colonial administrators who drink tea. Their wives drink tea together. They drink wine, schnapps, or whiskey, whatever. They play cards. They have very good time. And suddenly, after 6 months that the First World War began in Europe, they received a decree saying that they have to organize the war in the colonies. But of course, it's impossible for them to organize a war between themselves because. So they decided to recruit their own troops, Black troops, and to send them to make the war. So they're still sipping tea in front of the troops, playing war, being killed also because it's and it's the best comedy and caricature of colonialism. And the best scene is the last scene of the film because at the end, the Germans lost the war, whatever, and they had to, retreat. So everybody's sad, of course, because they were friends. And there is a Nigerian guy, so a black man, disguised as a Scottish guy with the pipes, who is, of course, playing the tunes of the farewell, to the Germans. It's a fantastic film. You have to see. And Jean-Jacques Annou is very famous because he's been doing a lot of films about the African scenes and etc. Now, concerning EILEEN, I have a question. Do they refer to the Roman Empire when they talk about this Mediterranean kind of spirit? That would be interesting because the Roman Empire was not divided, was not based on race, basically. That would be interesting. And my second remark is that, do you know maybe the work of Gérard Noiriel in France? He's been working on Italians and Polish migrants in France at the end of the 19th century. And what he shows is that a kind of racialization of religion, except they were Catholic. So basically, those guys, those migrants, were killed by the French in front of the church because they did have a different Catholicism and practices. And it was a kind of racialization of course, the Italian were supposed to be, of course, inferior because they were black also compared to the French Marseillais. So it was very kind of ironical. And the same for the Polish in the north of France. I don't know if you could use this, but I think it's a good parallel.
Let's collect a bit question. Louise, then Harald, then Paul Kramer, please.
Thank you. This is just a follow-up on the counterinsurgency discussion or thread. And I think it's, the relationship to both like uses of certain kinds of weaponry and race thinking, as well as counterinsurgency warfare and race thinking. In some ways, like with some people say the first counterinsurgency war was the American Civil War. And it didn't, of course, that was a war about race, but the campaigns in the South were against white people. So it's kind of interesting to think about the whole, how much counterinsurgency warfare is actually related or necessitates a kind of racial othering. And then the other issue is like weapons. And so the whole law of war as it gets developed in the late 19th century, there was this big debate, I think, at The Hague, 1896 or something, over dum-dum bullets. And then the Germans were saying, the British were uncivilized for using these dum-dum bullets. And anyway, it's a kind of an interesting problem this issue gets picked up later in the whole historiography around and public debates around the use of the atomic bomb. Was that a racist act by Americans? And some people say, well, the bomb was developed and they would have used it against the Germans, but Germany already surrendered. So anyway, it's sort of interesting to think about these other counter cases.
Harald, please. Let's add on one more here. Then.
Yeah, thank you very much. In the first presentation by Ulrike, I think this racial boundaries came across as quite fixed and stable. I think I was wondering now in the Q&A we have seen more and more exceptions and situations where this was not so clear, where this was contested, whether the concept of intersectionality may be of any use to see that various factors came into play. You mentioned the economic status with the Greeks who was making them either white or not so white, all these various shades. We have discussed religion. From my own research a long time ago on European prostitution in South Asian port cities, I know that it made a tremendous difference if they could be dubbed like Ukrainian Jewesses, who were not really European, and the natives would understand that. They would not confuse this. So there were various types of lesser whiteness and a subtle graduation. Religion, nationality obviously played a role. So the Irish whiteness in the British Empire was a different one than the English one. And as we have seen, the civilizational status this was ascribed in the case of the Japanese, who were seen as almost white because they had this fantastic fleet of warships.
Let's give the panelists a chance to respond to that bunch of questions. And now I have still 7 people on the list after that. So brief responses, brief questions.
Yeah, thank you very much for these questions. Counterinsurgency, I think in the literature it starts really with the small wars so this guerrilla wars against Napoleon's troops in Spain, and then Algeria, that's seen as a forerunner of the small wars also by Colbert. And so you have, and this racial thinking develops over the 19th century, then the wars against the Algerians and some wars in British Asia, 1857, the mutiny and so on, and that goes on, and it develops over the 19th century into this manuals. And these manuals are published in the 1890s, and they are quite clear on racial differentiation. So weapons and I think what they did in the colonies, they used weapons. For example, the British bombed people when they are hiding in Rhodesia, they used just bombs to kill everyone. They used machine guns. They used all sorts of stuff they wouldn't have used after the Hague conventions. They all signed the Hague Conventions, but it was explicit that this doesn't apply to savage wars, because it was not a war against another nation, because these were seen as insurgents in their own country, because the colony is not another nation. And so the Hague wouldn't apply, and that was quite strict, and it was always used in every argument. Anyway, intersectionality. Yeah, I think it's a good of course it's a good proposal to do this, because it was always also religion, it was cultural status. For example, in Southwest Africa, people argue, oh, my wife is not really black because she plays piano. She was mixed race, but she is really white, and she has. So it's always also about status, economy. It's about cultural things, but. It is a quite, I think, in the late 19th century, in the early 20th century, race becomes quite a big signifier in the colonies. But of course, you have to see it's always contested. And it's always a discussion who is really white and who is lesser white, as you say. I mean, it's always, but there's people who are definitely always white, and that's the sort of the Northern Europeans, British, French, German, and they are always super white, and the others are then, so it depends more or less. The Portuguese, in some colonies, because they are not so, they don't adhere to the strict racial segregation and so on and so forth. So it's all this, it's a lot of discussion going on. It's quite complicated. I leave it at that.
Race is complicated.
Yeah.
So for Veronique's question, yes, the Italians did refer to the Roman Empire quite a bit in their imperial project. And the cover of La Difesa della Razza that I included in the paper, you can see this quite clearly. There's an image of a kind of Roman statue head that's supposed to represent Italians, and a gladiator sword that separates that figure from a caricature of a Semitic person and a black person. And so that's a part of the idea of establishing a racial hierarchy based on a connection to a Roman past. And it was a past that through archaeological expeditions in Libya, they claimed gave them some special purchase in North Africa and a special claim to governing North Africans and Muslims. But when it came down to the possibility of, in the moment of annexation of Libya in the late 1930s, a possibility of extending citizenship to Libyans, to Arabs, to Muslims, no. That was a definite problem for imperialists who were afraid, and they say it quite explicitly in the archives. They were nervous that would mean that extending citizenship would mean that more Libyan men would go to Italy and marry white Italian women, just like Ramadan Ali did. And so that's where, when you're talking about racialization, I think what these stories tell us is just how contextual racialization is and has been in the past, and how contested ideas of whiteness are or have been, how many different ideas of whiteness we have, or we have legacies of. And so when you talk about racialization of Poles, I mean, I was at a conference last week and people were bringing up the Italian Adriatic during the Second World War. There are a lot of different forms of othering that maybe we can call racialization, but I have to think more about that and kind of theorize it more carefully, because I do think it's important to take seriously religious othering as something that's culturally distinctive from biological racialization.
Paul Kramer, then Miguel Geronimo, and Alexander Kiese.
Maybe you want to take all of them together?
Yes. We just collect. Yeah, we just have these three, and then we continue to collect. Yes, Paul, please.
Yes, I wanted to ask a question about the limits of racialization and the ways in which colonial elites and officers, thought about the ways in which non-European actors, and especially elites, received European racism and the ways that they reacted and potentially revolted against that. And here I'm just thinking about the fact that, we sort of know that imperial networks in this era, and even, in lots of cases, imperial states, were cross-racial in the European senses, right? They have lots of bureaucrats, they have lots of contractors, right? They have educated elites that are working in the civil service, right? So you have what are effectively these hierarchical, multiracial states in which white supremacy is an organizing principle, and yet the state itself is, in some complicated ways, hierarchically integrated. And so I'm wondering if there's any sense that you have to balance that overt, aggressive, confident sort of racist assertion against concessions, particularly to non-European elites who can leverage the piano, right? It can leverage higher education, expertise in the colonial state to assert their rights. And is there a sense that if you don't make concessions, or if you're too aggressive in your assertion of racial privilege, you could provoke reaction, revolt, and even overthrow?
Up to the back to the Montagnards.
Well, thank you so much. This is for Ulrike. Thank you for your paper. I wonder, you addressed the World War I as a moment of disruption. While reading a lot of recently materials about post-1945 efforts of interior cooperation, what happened during the First World War was celebrated as an early moment of inter-imperial cooperation, not disruption. To what extent are you not looking to the First World War essentially through German eyes? Because it appears that for a lot of European colonial powers, the First World War was a moment in time to celebrate about the potentials, the advantages of inter-imperial cooperation, and also secondly, even if perhaps more generic question, when you talk about the spatialization of difference, especially in urban contexts. To what extent that history must be necessarily framed in a larger context. There's a longue durée history of management of diversity, and therefore there's also a longue durée history of urban specialization of mechanisms to deal with that diversity. I wonder if your maps can be understood in, let's say, a coheval analytical framework, and if they actually must bring you to the 16th century and the 17th century and do not only a long-durary history, but also a global history. And I'm thinking about a lot of maps from the Spanish and the Portuguese empires that are more important to the Portuguese in Africa late in the 19th century than are what the British or the French are doing in other parts of Africa in that same period. So it's a question also of chronology.
Yeah. Alexander Kaiser.
Well, thank you for these two papers. And, well, I have two questions for Ulrike, which have to do with, well, with what you discuss in part in your paper and regarding the literature. And I'm just interested to know if we see these classic positions, if we are beyond that already, or what you think. For example, you mention in your paper the reference to Odile Gerg, for example, and the fact that there has been this strong trend to say, well, much about segregation in colonial cities has to do with biomedical fears, and the fact that colonial planners think, well, if we don't segregate, then all these epidemics and illnesses will come to us, like malaria and yellow fever and so on. Odile Gerg especially insisted so much on that. What is your thought about that? How important is that really? I mean, you mentioned that, but how would you qualify that in your overall discussion? And the second point, thinking of what you identified, well, I also suppose it's a classical sort to say First World War as a rupture, and I was thinking of Michael Adder's 2004 famous article, of course, about contesting hegemony. And there again, I would like to know, are we far beyond that right now? Do we know much more about how that First World War experience affected perspectives of the colonized, for example? What's your thought on that? And just a very quick question for EILEEN. Well, I have a feeling I should know more about what the Italian civilizing mission was, but I don't. So I just wondered, I mean, if you take the late 30s as a rupture, then would that be in a way getting away from an earlier model where something like assimilation or imagining the colonized or a small part of the colonized as being more easily integrated into a kind of Italian, perhaps imperial society? Was it a rupture from that, or how to imagine that point? And could that also have something to do with Mussolini's white settlement programs?
I have 4 more people on the list for short statements. Cyrus, Christoph, Emmanuel, and Vladimir. Then we will go in.
Thank you so much to you both. A quick question for EILEEN. How did Black Italy relate to Black France, Germany, Netherlands, etc., from the late 1930s, and particularly in the Second World War? So it's clear that there is this relationship to Germany, like you point this out, right? But the policies that are implemented in Italy, how do they compare? Particularly because in the Second World War, I mean, the continental German Empire exists for a few years. And maybe it is an empire of empires within the continent, right? So how does this, do we see a Europeanness taking place here of policies vis-a-vis Africans in Europe, those living in Europe?
Christoph.
Yes, my question goes to Ulrike. I found the argument that racism could allow for cooperation between different empires quite convincing. And I was wondering about cooperation in terms of anti-racism. I mean, you mentioned W.E.B. Du Bois with this famous quote about the color line. And I mean, Du Bois obviously was held in high esteem by Max Weber. He had close contacts to Franz Boas for challenging scientific racism. So could you say a little bit more about cooperation between whites and non-whites, so anti-racist cooperation, but also between Africans and people from other colonies who were establishing cooperation to challenge racism?
If you could pass it on to Vladimir directly. Thank you.
Thank you very much for two brilliant papers. So, two questions. For Ulrike, so I'm wondering about how this concept of whiteness or of white superiority, how it evolved over time, right? What elements predominated? Was it anti-black racism, or class superiority, or anti-Muslim sentiments in the Muslim colonies, or just opposition to anti-colonialism? And also whether you find it analytically useful to disentangle all this. And then for Eileen, the notion of multi-tier citizenship depending on one's race, this is of course not unique to Italy. Do you know how this idea of a separate, watered-down citizenship come to fascist Italy? Like, where did they take it from, or was it uniquely, in the fascist created in the fascist context, and whether it in any way survived in Italy after World War II?
Can you pass it directly to Emmanuel? Thank you.
Thank you very much for these two insightful papers. I have a question for Eileen, very quickly. You refer to diversity, or at least perceptions of diversity within Italy, within the north and the south, between the north and the south, as an element of that troubles this attempt to set a color line somehow. But you didn't refer to another element of difference that was quite important at the time, which is the two populations that were annexed at the end of the war and were defined in League of Nations language, Russian minorities in Venezia Giulia and South Tyrol. And I was wondering whether in this hierarchical ordering of races, civilizations, ethnic groups in Italy, do they fit in your picture? And if yes, how? If not, why? Thanks.
So it is impossible to answer that pile of questions, of course, but still the panelists should have the last word, or in one sentence, please.
Okay, I don't know. Limits of racialization, yeah, non-European elites. Of course it was, I don't know how to do that because they're so different. Anyway, I would say it's right that this was very much centered on Africa. And if you talk about Asia, you have to do it differently, right? So it's not non-European elites started to react to this, and it was very much it was very different in settler states and non-settler states how elites could react and how the white people did then react to them. And so you have to make a lot of concessions to different forms of colonial states and how this worked out. And then segregation, I think biomedical spheres become more important at the end of the 19th century. Before that it wasn't so important, and spatial segregation or spatial layout of these colonial cities, that was taken from the Spanish. That's quite clear. But the racial, biological racialization that took place in the thinking of the French and British and German administrators, that came at the end of the 19th century, and that had also a lot to do with biomedical thinking, and I think it was important. But the other important thing was, of course, to rule and to have a segregated field for the whites and to protect them, things like that. Anyway, I leave it at that. Maybe you can ask me tonight.
Okay, so I'll try to be as quick. Paul, confident racial assertion is not what we're talking about. We're talking about the fragility of white prestige. That's what these stories are telling us, and especially in the face of elites from the colonies, and that's we can talk more about that over the aperitif. But the fear was about Italian workers showing up how they weren't really white. And what changed in the 30s? Yes, it was a number of things. I wish Patrick were here to tell you more about the settlement programs, but that was a big part of it. The issue was it was a bunch of stuff. There was the Axis. There was all these. Italian workers were going to go to East Africa, and there was a practice of concubinage known as madamismo that threatened to, was part of how the fascist and the liberal state really sold imperialism to Italians. You get to go to East Africa and experience all kinds of pleasures, and that threatened racial purity. So the civilizing mission isn't really the language here, I would suggest. It's very different. How does it compare to other black Europeans in World War II in terms of policies? I don't know, that's a good question. I think I had an answer a second ago and I've forgotten it now. Let me get back to you on that. There's a lot of great questions here. And I would say, I mean, no, I had a thought, but I can't think of it right now. Vladimir, I don't know where it came from. I think it was where this watered down citizenship idea, I mean, of course they were looking around and looking at different models. You know, it's obviously not unique to Italy, but it was the kind of tracking of East Africans and Libyans in the Italian metropole that, in my understanding, is fairly unique, at least. And for Venezia Giulia and the South Tyrol, I've just figured out how to deal with racialization of Arab Muslims. So give me a minute. I would suggest the work of Pamela Ballinger if you haven't encountered her work on. She works a lot on exactly that issue. And I thank you for that question. I think it's an important one.
So thank you to the panelists and thank you to the audience for a lively discussion. Thank you.